that is working across Africa, the Feminist Economics Collective, is that we really want to build the capacities of women's rights organizations, of individual activists, of media, as well as even for women's rights organizations as well. And we want to do this through what we call the African Feminist Macroeconomic Academy. And this is an annual academy that we do where we really break down macro level issues. And we've done this looking at illicit financial flows. We've done this looking at the world of work and also on financializations. We also generate knowledge in terms of how do we generate knowledge amongst the different activists, how also do we also link with the different allies as well, and also how do we start strategically influencing. So we always hear issues around, oh yes, we are to just have women on the table, but what exactly is the underlying analysis? What is what are the gendered implications that are being presented, and how do we make sure that we are influencing the agenda in a very strategic way? Then the other pathway is for us to also start building a movement that really links the work that women's rights organizations are doing, work that also links with the different institutions, as well as the different structures that are there in terms of working with individual activists on one hand and feminist economists on the other. This so that we can also tackle development issues through macro level economy policy shifts. So this is what Crystal, like you were asking in terms of why we commissioned this paper and what we really want. I think overall we really want to influence macro level economic policy making to be more gender transformative, to be fair, and also to be for there to be equitable distribution of resources in Africa. So the CFTA is really pivotal in terms of really it has to be centered in terms of really looking at other dimensions that go beyond financial inclusion, but really looking at some of the elements around the social contracts that is there between the different countries. How would that also impact? Looking at the issues that Chenai was also bringing out, when we know when women who are trading, the issues of violence against women, the harassment, just making sure that the playing field is level, but also making sure that there are adequate resources and that the process is well thought out, like what Fatimah talks about in terms of making sure that the CFTA process is really sequential. It doesn't leave anyone behind, but also that it's embedded in a Pan-African Ubuntu way. So I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Memory. I will now go into a Q&A. There's one question that I can see in the chat, and I'll probably come to you, Fatimah. We have 15 minutes left, so I'll keep this to about 14 minutes so we can say goodbye. To what extent, Fatimah, do you think there's any positive space for the realization of gender equality? And I know that's a tough one. And there's a lot of questions and gaps to be addressed. But is there anything that we see as a positive out of this that we can hold on to, grow, and really, really make something out of it?
Yeah, you've given me a very hard question there, Crystal. Thank you. This is what I will say in response to that. And, it is quite top line to a certain extent, but I think the fact that we are able to talk about women's equality within this agreement is the one positive light to look at. To answer the question directly, to what extent do I think this actually helps the realization and improvement of equal gender participation in the economic sector? And in terms of the measures that have been put in, I would say it's completely down to interpretation. And that actually is the problem. So like I said in my presentation, the CFTA itself makes just a cursory reference to gender equality. You know, there is no reference in terms of women's economic rights more broadly. And the narrative so far has been dominated by the onus being on countries themselves within their implementation plans to make the CFTA work for women. So in terms of what that means essentially that countries will be the ones that will have to do all of the research and analysis at the sectoral level in order to understand what the likely impacts will be, to look at all of the tariff lists and understand what the likely impacts will be on women, to really understand how not just to create a narrative around opportunities for women within value chains, but to be honest about what the negative fallouts will be as adjustments are made. And this comes to this issue again of mitigation. And then to prepare on the back of that analysis, an entire framework of an approach within their implementation of the CFTA that will help to create the opportunities that are being promised at the moment within many of the documents that look at women specifically, that have been produced by various organizations. They have to be created at the moment because the liberalization process itself will cause disruptions across the board, and that's acknowledged. So you have to defend against and then create at the same time. And countries are being left to their own devices at the moment to do that when it comes to gender equality. And as we know, the issue is we have huge inequalities between our countries. Even our wealthiest countries will struggle to put that into place for a variety of different reasons, related to resource allocation, but also just related to capacity, but also just sensitization. How many have even thought about doing it in any meaningful way? But in terms of hope, what does it actually, what hope is there? We are having this conversation now. And I think what Memory said in her presentation is absolutely critical. We need to create a movement around this. The average African does not know what the African CFTA is. Let's be completely honest about that. The average African citizen is not aware. So this whole project has not been given the limelight and the showcase that it needs to have been, whether we're talking about infomercials, huge, social media presence, in order to be able to reach everybody so that they can understand it. And it has not been broken down in a way that is also understandable for the average citizen. I mean, to be perfectly honest, my paper, commissioned by FEMNET, has been written to try and reach women's organizations and women's activists so that they can be empowered in order to know the processes and engage with some of the issues from an advocacy perspective. We need to be doing a lot more of that in order to reach everybody. And there have already been obviously concerns around the level of engagement that the entire CFTA process has had with civil society organizations. I'm sure that's already been debated so far. I heard it in the debrief before we started. Much more is needed, but this is a major concern. Until we have all of that in place, in all honesty, the hope remains currently a light. It is there, but it's a small light and it needs to grow, but only if we can get movement in these areas. So that is the best response I can give in terms of hope, because what I don't want to do is undermine how critical a situation we are in right now and how critical it is that we have this issue taken really seriously.
Thank you, Fatimah. Chenai, in your final remarks as we say goodbye, with the lens that you carry and working within the tax justice space, and considering that, the AfCFTA might provide space for multinationals to come in against a backdrop of us losing, between $50 and $100 billion annually through illicit financial flows, depending on who you ask. What do you see your biggest work in, and how do you begin to respond to movement building that both Fatimah and Memory have put so eloquently forward in the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Crystal. And I think Fatimah actually alluded to it earlier when she was sort of giving a bit of an overview in terms of the companies that we have on the continent, how many of them have shareholders, for example, that are external, how many of them are actually owned by external companies. And so I think within the lens of the CFTA, this is definitely something that we need to be keeping an eye out, because ultimately what you'll tend or what we could potentially see is not necessarily it being African indigenous companies that are benefiting, rather those that are multinational. And I think the minute you start to bring in that conversation, then you start to see a much more likelihood of, exactly like you've indicated, illicit financial flows, which of course would be a concern and undermines really what we're trying to achieve with the CFTA. And so I think this goes back to the point that was raised by the moderator earlier, and I think reiterated by Fatimah. We definitely need to start to do a lot more awareness raising on some of these potential issues. We need to get citizens much more engaged with these processes so that they're aware. I think right now, for example, as we start thinking through phase 2 conversations, there is still room for us to, try and democratize some of these conversations, because this is so crucial to make sure that really what's the outcome is something that will be beneficial to not just MNCs and companies, but the average person on the street.
Thank you, Chenai. And last but definitely not least, Memory, the conversation and the narrative of a resilient African woman who is able to withstand hardship and still manages to rise beyond this. Second question. That's not a phone in my background. Is something that I question, this narrative of an African woman's resilience. And I wonder what that means up against the movement that FEMNET is part of on the continent, and up against very Pan-African ideated frameworks such as the AfCFTA, and what that means for you going forward. And if you see any glimmer of hope, like Fatimah put it, and a space that you can broaden that glimmer of light and hope to be a little bit more sparkly, a little bit more hopeful, and a little bit more shining light on all these other things, because all oppression is linked and we have lots of different issues facing African women and girls as well.
Thanks, Crystal. I think for me, just to say, as we talk of Pan-Africanism, one thing that has also been missing across the continent is women's contribution. So I think it's so refreshing to be able to be in a space and a time where we have a scholarship, like, building up that scholarship, where we can also talk about where women need to be, and also, having our own African knowledge, which we can also put forward, particularly for a process like CFTA. And for us, this paper, this is why it was so important, and also engaging and working with Fatimah and putting together, because we are actually building what it's more like actually giving an alternative. And I think the hope is in accepting that we really need an alternative. And if that can be something that we can also get to push forward and say, an alternative also that is not ashamed to really say, we talk a lot about women at the center, we talk a lot about gender equality, but without actually looking and addressing it systematically and structurally. So I think this is a great opportunity even for Tana Forum to be able to, to be bold enough, to have this side event, which really talks about a feminist alternative. And we say feminist because we talk about the power analysis, which just goes beyond just including women, talking about women being there, but actually looking at the broader and saying there's absolutely something wrong with our current economic system, and the global financial system needs to be redesigned, and what's so more at this point. And I think the hope that I have is that CFTA, if we really go and base it on our Pan-African ethos and really start being inclusive and looking at the different intersections that are there, and not just relegated to individual countries, relegated to some of the orthodox kind of like economic model, then I don't think we will achieve much. So I think the hope is, if we are open to this alternative and to a feminist alternative, I think the hope is there if we really are bold enough to take it on and not just have women just as an add-on, but really have the thought leadership that looks at the gendered impacts of the CFTA.
Thank you very much, Memory. Thank you so much, Fatimah, Chenai, Memory, for giving us your space, your time, your wisdom, and your thought leadership with us this afternoon. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to be, speaking with you on the same panel, albeit virtually, all the way through to Ethiopia at the Tana Forum. It's been really exciting. It's been a journey to get here. This was really, really amazing. We will be tweeting about it. We will be talking about this more, and we hope that more knowledge around this is produced. Now we will be is actually currently putting together a repository of African women's thought leadership on macro level economic policy, and that will come through to the world by December. So we're really excited about that and really excited to include work like this in that repository to share with not just African and influence African policies, but globally as well. And I think that's important. I stop with a quote by Oriol Kolo that says, "We can't entrepreneur our way around bad leadership. We can't entrepreneur our way around bad policies. Those of us who have managed to entrepreneur ourselves out of it are living in a very false security in Africa. There is growth in Africa, but Africans are not growing. And we have to question, why is there this big push for us to innovate ourselves around problems that our leaders, our taxes, our policymakers, ourselves, to be quite frank, should be grappling with?" I think the COVID pandemic presents an opportunity where we can move away from the norm, from this neoliberal structure of economy globally, and really chart a way forward that is different, that is African, and that is ours. I say thank you. Asante sana. I pass now back to Brian Kagoro and wish you all well with the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Memory, Chenai, Fatimah, for an engaging session. The challenge for African leaders, the challenge for African policymakers, and those driving the AfCFTA is not only to engage in listening to and hearing people, but ensuring that groups such as AWI are able to shape the trajectory of the AfCFTA, and that not only is there a commitment to rethink certain things, but there be a commitment to take on board the lived experiences, the thoughts, the inputs of those who will have and live with the consequences of AfCFTA. And I think that this is a huge challenge for policy. We're going to be talking to policymakers in the next 15 minutes, and hopefully some of the participants who've joined this particular conversation will stay on to ask some of the very senior policymakers that are joining the next conversation some of the questions raised. The commitment at TANA is not to make any issue of pertinence a ghetto. It's also not to just talk about issues. TANA is not a policy-making platform, but it's a space where we enable dialogue to happen. And it's up to policymakers and also activists, artists, and academics that come here to ensure that beyond TANA, these conversations are actually taken on board in reshaping African policy. If there is tea and coffee, unfortunately, the breaks today are very small. I'll ask that you take 10 minutes, try and grab a coffee or a tea, and then return for another engaging session. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, as I've already said, to the wonderful panel that we've had, and see you in the next 13 minutes. Pom pom. So somebody was asking me what a pom pom is. It's exactly that. Please, tea and tea and coffee are free. Yeah,